Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick, where we talk about emerging technologies with creatives and technologists around Web3, XR tech, and of course, our generative AI is talk of the town. So we always throw a little bit of that in there as well. Diego, you're one of the people that I think has been the most successful at creating content around go-to-market, not just around how this technology is going to change the world and the philosophies around 30 years from now, or these big ideas that everyone's talking about, but you come from the enterprise space. You've worked with marketing for big brands. You've worked with the Web3 studios of actual companies trying to get involved with Web3, with NFTs, with 3D spatial computing. And I think that what you've done with LinkedIn is incredibly impressive. 30,000 followers, over 10 million impressions. You're speaking at all these events, like the MasterCard Innovation Summit, Future of Digital Fashion in the Netherlands, Meta Festival. You've become a really well-respected name in this space, both for your work with enterprise companies and with early-stage startups. And so I think you're the absolute perfect person to talk about these topics with, not just about the technology, but pragmatically, how can brands play with the technology? How can they use it to deliver real business outcomes? So with all that said, I'd love to dive into a little bit of your background, a little bit of your story, and then we can talk about some of this great work that you're doing. So maybe let's start there. First, thanks for being here. Maybe you could tell us where you are and where you come from.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that's a hell of an intro. I love the name. I couldn't stop thinking about shouting Meta Rick all the time, like Rick and Morty style. I just love it.
I love that you say that because I actually want to change the theme.
I'm Meta Rick.
To get the Rick Sanchez voice, so that's actually gonna happen.
Oh, it's gonna be like Meta Rick.
Yeah, totally.
I love that. Thanks, dude. Yeah, it means a lot for me. Like I've been just working really hard, pushing this space forward and doing my best, as much as I can to sort of like get my stake of pushing this industry as well. So appreciate your words. My overall background is I started working when I was 16 years old on the agency side back in Brazil. So I'm from Brazil. I live today in Portugal, so in Europe. Lived in a couple of different countries, Canada, Germany, Indonesia, and ended up here in Portugal now for the last 3 years. So back when I started working was all about big brands. I have been working with big brands my whole life, right? Back in this agency, through the agency, we had clients like Red Bull, Samsung, Warner Bros, Microsoft. And what we were doing back there, which brought me to where I am today, was basically looking into esports as a new upcoming culture where you're merging technology, right? Consoles, PCs, and you merging a new culture. So people that are actually, like really deep into that space with what is the potential for brands to tap into that, right? What could be interesting for them to do. So that was the first contact I got to marketing, to digital strategies, to, brands, to brand building, to new cultures, to technology. And back in 2007, the console was sitting in the basement, not in the living room. Right, so the perception of gaming was nerds, geeks sitting in the basement, drinking, cola and just like hanging out, right? And that has evolved a lot from a perception perspective. We know where gaming is at today and what it represents from many levels in culture, revenue, brand perception, and so on. So I spent most of my career sort of like at the edge of what's next in culture and technology, so sort of like that intersection. And back in 2017, I got into blockchain. Really got excited about the possibilities, sort of like the enterprise applications to that use case and all of that. Spent a lot of time in that space trying to find out my sort of like entry point, which was really difficult back there because I wanted to like work with, blockchain native companies and everything was just about the tech, right? Still is a lot just about the tech, which is one of the problems within our industry still. In 2018, I got into Adidas and in Germany, in the headquarters. And there, one of the first things they started trying to do was like, hey, listen, blockchain is interesting. What about we do this? What about do that? And give ideas within the company of what we could do with blockchain. But, everything connected to supply chain, proof of provenance, proof of sustainability, for example, right? Showing customers, where the shoes are coming from, for example, especially the ones that are linked with sustainability. And I just didn't got enough traction, right? It's extremely difficult to move the needle within that level, within such big organizations. And everything changed in May 2021 when, I got together with a couple friends from the brand that were building a strategy for Adidas to enter the metaverse, to enter Web3, to do something within NFTs. And we all have been in blockchain for a while, in crypto for a while, and we're start exploring sort of like, NFTs as a new, just a new possibility within that world of blockchain. And we got together, we built Into the Metaverse, which was launched by Adidas back in December 2021. Was a success as it was. I'm really grateful to have been part of that project. And then from there, I just went on to do what I always done. I was consulting Adidas for 4 years as an external partner. And then from there, I went to work with other brands to replicate or to try to sort of like, build and reshape new strategies for the now, as you said, not for like the fluffy future, the 20 years down the road. Is like, what can be done now, right? How can we get going now? And yes, be prepared for the future. Yes, be well positioned. But how do we go to market now? So that's what I've been doing for this almost last 3 years now.
So there's a bunch of things I want to unpack, but I want to start with some stuff about your career first, and then we can pivot into the technologies for brands. So you started a small agency, or mid-sized agency. Was it a gaming studio focused on producing games, or what type of agency were you working for?
It was an agency that was focused on building events and building digital experiences for brands within gaming. So we would run, for example, I don't know if you ever heard World Cyber Games is the biggest competition for esports. That Samsung killed that, but back on the day it was like Olympic Games for esports. So we had like Counter-Strike, we had Pool back on the time, we had FIFA and several other games that people would be competing against, World of Warcraft and all of that. They would compete against in 64 different countries, and then they would get the best teams from those countries, and then they would bring to one grand final where everybody would compete against, and the world class would come out of that, right? We were responsible for organizing that in Brazil. So we would run the whole country, 26 different states, just running, every single weekend a different competition between all players to get the best of the country to then bring to the Olympics. So that was really exciting. Samsung was such good track back then, but then they just killed that at a certain point, and now esports is what it is.
Yeah, I think esports is such a great catalyst for all of the things that we talk about with Web3 and this idea of the future of a more immersive spatial internet, right? Like, there's so many different words people use to describe it. I think because of Apple, spatial computing's been the big one lately that people are more comfortable with. One. But we'll see how that looks in 12 months. But that idea of esports changing, I remember when League of Legends championships got more viewers than the Super Bowl. And that was a huge kind of indicator for me that I'm like, wait a minute, I was never a hardcore gamer growing up. Like, sure, I played some of the old Nintendo games with my dad, like Pokemon Stadium on N64 and old 007 GoldenEye. And like, I've been around it, but I've never been like a super hardcore, like top 1% on Halo or anything like some of my friends. But when I saw that moment that I'm like, wait, more people are streaming this video game tournament than they are the Super Bowl that people are paying tens of millions of dollars for an ad spot for, that's insane. That means there's an interest here that I don't think is being fully recognized. And then, of course, a few years later, that starts to be recognized more and more, and we start to see advertising dollars start to funnel into games. Like when you play something like 2K, there's branding everywhere inside that game, right? Like, it's become a real opportunity for brands to connect with their fans through that kind of gaming channel. When you're working in an agency, though, I think one of the big advantages is you have exposure to multiple big companies and lots of big projects, and like it helps you like get your skills up to speed a lot faster if you can survive in that environment, because it's pretty fast paced.
It's gnarly, yeah.
But it's very, very different when you go into the brand side. To your point, there's more bureaucracy, things move a little slower. Could you talk us through a little bit of that transition of going from the agency side into working inside of the brand, like why you made that change and kind of how it might have been different in the skills that you picked up on the brand side?
Yeah, I love to think about, intelligence or sort of like perspective combined with, or being kind of like having its provenance on exposure of knowledge, right? So what I mean by that is the more exposure you get of different things, the better you can become at, several different things. And then when you combine all of that together, I think is where you build your expertise, right? So throughout my life was always like that. I was like agency side, client side, agency side, client side, and being sort of like left and right and work with different agencies that are also innovation agencies, right? While in Germany, I was working with with an innovation agency that we were doing stuff in the industrial metaverse, as we call right now, through helping companies to optimize their processes. We were using different AR and VR goggles to help them sort of like visualize better ways of manufacturing and so on. And we were talking about AI as well back in 2016 for that so-called Industry 4.0 that Germany is really hot on. So this type of exposure from an agency side for me is really exciting because I didn't need to go like super deep into a tech company and get really techy and go there and be the hardware provider, for example. So being that sort of like service provider or building software with the agency has given me a lot of exposure to different industries and in different segments, as well as it was with that initial agency that I worked before, right? So exactly what you just said, the key difference from agency side to like Fortune 500 or big brand side is just speed, right? Is speed. You're always at the edge of everything. You're never behind. You always have to be ahead because if you want to survive within, especially this space of tech, which is moving super fast, and you want to be on the agency side, which is building experience or building service or building software, you need to be at the edge of what's next, right? As a brand, it's different because Adidas doesn't have to play with all the upcoming new technologies and be at the edge of everything to succeed, right? They have to do what they do really well, which is selling shoes and finding ways on which they can build on selling more shoes and making better products is a process along the way, but they don't have to be at the edge of everything, right? Which a lot of times make you more comfortable, quote unquote, because you don't need to keep pushing every time. But at the same time, you sort of like have that bigger impact, which you don't have in an agency. So what we've done with Into the Metaverse, the impact it had in the industry and also like in the company per se is being ginormous compared to what it would have been if it would have been just a startup or just an agency. So I think that in short, what I'm really excited about the difference is that in the agency you have more speed, you move faster, you can fail more often, you can break things, you can sort of like be always at the edge depending on the agency you're working on, especially if you're talking like tech, right? Where we were talking about, which is in the other hand on the big companies that have impact. Right, you can do bigger things. You can have like a bigger platform, which is good and bad, right? Because if you fuck it up, is a big fuck up. If you do well, then it's a big doing well, right? So it's always sort of like a double sword, but double-edged sword. But it's the main difference. I think it's there, and it's a matter of I like navigating several different words, right? Right now, even in Web3, I navigate that word of like I talk to the biggest brands in the planet. Work with some, network with others, know really well others. But at the same time, I'm like spending a lot of my time with like the ones really building the tech at the edge of it, right? So you need to keep a balance of what do they need and how can they provide and combine how do we push this space forward. So I'm always like navigating different ecosystems in that sense. I think I'm a strong believer that the more exposure you get, the more knowledge you can build as soon as you start puzzling those things together.
Yeah, and for the big brands, I mean, there's just so much more risk involved, right? And that's part of why the agencies exist in the first place. Is like they need to mitigate that risk by bringing on external partners that have mastered certain skill sets and can move faster. Because I mean, that's the difference between a big agency and a mid-sized agency, right? Is like you have companies like Accenture that are like just paving the way with hundreds of thousands of employees that can just take on a massive undertaking of building this stuff up front. But then you've got these mid-sized agencies that are just like fully committed to Roblox, for example, and just like completely lean in on that one platform. And they know the terminology, they understand the user behaviors, they've done 50 other projects for 50 other brands. So if you want to do an activation in Roblox, then that type of agency might be better for you than going with a massive consulting firm, right? Like it just kind of depends on the campaign or the project. When you mentioned that you were starting to get interested in blockchain for Adidas and back in I think like 2018, which is a ways before the hype cycle, a ways before all of these brands started getting involved. I know Exclusible, it's a Web3 agency that I do some advisory work with, their Metaverse Leaders program, and they expressed how much of an uphill battle it was to try and get these luxury brands to adopt NFT projects. They got told no maybe like 14, 15 times. Their team has a ton of background working in luxury goods, so they have really well connected networks in that space. But what ended up cracking the code for them is they actually built their own NFT project, and then successfully were able to sell for a few $1 million and get a decent amount of traction with their own project. And that was a big risk, but it gave them some credibility so that when they went back to those same brands, all of a sudden they're all leaning into it and they're all actually buying activations because they've now seen it work and they saw Exclusive will take that risk up front. So I'm wondering for you, like what changed over the course of those next couple of years where the team did take on and did decide to move into Web3 and run this experiment that ended up being quite successful. What do you think changed for Adidas from being so hesitant to finally taking it on and kind of moving forward?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think to address your first point, I'm a strong believer that to learn how to drive a car, you need to drive a car. And this is exactly what Exclusible did, right? Like, okay, like not necessarily learn, but, prove you can. So like, oh, I'm really good, driver. Oh, like I just gonna believe on you when I'm sitting right beside you and I see you driving a car. Oh, you can drive a car really well. So okay, let's go together, right? So I'm really a strong believer of that, and I feel that that's lacking a lot within our industry still. Because as you said before, it's all about like, oh, in 10 years from now, that's what's gonna happen. Oh, the future of this is that, and blah blah blah, and it's so hard to find use cases on the now or things that we can prove by showing that it works rather than telling it will work. And I think that's where we still sort of like behind our adoption in that sense from enterprise, especially in our industry. And then sort of like to your second point, I think that in 2018, the conversation which we had, and I pitched that to today the CDO of Adidas, and there was a whole work stream there looking into sustainability, and I pitched that back there, and I think that back there, the conversation was so much on the tech from a sort of like a supply chain perspective. So there's so many moving parts, right? Because one of the pitches was, imagine if you could have within the app a part of the app that you can go and trace where the shoe that you were about to buy or you've bought or that you own, where did it came from, what was the positive impact that it created, because Adidas has that Parlay brand, right, which is all about plastic bottles that are recycled and transformed into products, right? So imagine if you can trace back those bottles, where they came from, the positive impact they created in the community. Let's say that you source that from Indonesia, you could create a lot of UGC content from how that place looked before, how it looked after, how was the cleanup, and sort of like have the whole supply chain on chain that gives you transparency and visibility on what is being built, right? Or how it sort of like got to your hands and the impact you had on that, carbon emissions, blah, blah, blah. I think that one was too complex because, if you start tapping those supply chain of those brands, there's like hundreds and hundreds of suppliers and you don't have transparency in all of them, unfortunately. And two, sustainability wasn't as hot or as, sort of like a top of head as it is right now, right? We start hearing more and more about it, and it's all about it right now, right? So I think that those were sort of like the key factors. And the main difference of what happened after was we didn't necessarily need to go too deep into the tech of what's happening. We went on culture. That's why Originals was the brand that was chosen to do so, because Originals is all about culture versus, the other side of Adidas, which is all about sports and performance and so on. So it was very connected with culture, was very connected with like, we want to be where the cool kids are at, and we want to be the cool brand that's going to be their choice, right? So once you start looking from that culture angle, and it's exactly what the project has been doing since the beginning, and now with Out is exactly that. Is that self-expression, is being connected to upcoming culture, is being really deep into that space, and giving ways on which people can sort of like take part on that, right? And the technology, by the way, enable things like collaboration, co-creation, yalla yalla yalla. So I think that was the main angle, and the difference is that we didn't necessarily ask for permission back then, right? It was really like, okay, we're gonna do this thing. We got some support from here and there, and we just went with it, right? And after the fact is when the company sort of like got to know more about what was happening, but was not something that we went around everywhere asking for permission everywhere. Which, if it would have been the case, I don't know, it might have changed the course of what happened.
It's really interesting, the two counterexamples, because the first example you brought up, while it has challenges, right, that you mentioned, like too complex, and you couldn't actually trace every single supplier, and there's issues with that campaign being practical or able to do it. But what's cool about it is that's a real problem that blockchain technology can solve for, is this idea
100%.
of traceability and then attaching the history of an item to an item. I think in automotive and with luxury goods, there's a huge opportunity for attaching history and authentication to an asset, having this digital twin that follows it owner to owner, so that when you go in and get your service records, they just exist as a part of the car, rather than it being something you have to go hunt down for a piece of paper or call an old mechanic to go find it. It should just live on that car for any incident or anything that happens with the car in the future. And so that idea that you're talking about with traceability of the object, I think that's actually an under talked about use case, is things like that. I think that's where there's a real actual problem being solved by a technology, versus the big critique everyone has for blockchain is that it's a technology in search of a problem. The second point, though, the one that Adidas actually moved forward with, is this cultural sense of ownership, is being able to give your community a feeling that they have a stake in your product and your brand, and they get to lean into that sense of ownership. But that is, I feel like it's been getting a lot of flack lately, because many of those projects use like custodial wallets or like walled gardens, where it's like, do you really have ownership of the asset if it's something you sign up with an email instead of with your own wallet? And so I'm curious, is that more of a perception, kind of a marketing play with NFTs, is to give this idea of ownership, or is there like an actual need for blockchain to be involved in that process? Because I feel like a lot of brands are doing similar campaigns where they're using email logins instead of NFTs now, but they're just kind of labeling it as an NFT, kind of like the Starbucks program. I think is a good example of that.
Yeah. I think that there's 2 points here, right? The first one is, what's the audience that you want to target, right? And in Adidas' case back there, and also Starbucks, and any, Lacoste is another example that's of a brand that's doing exactly what you just said. Nike is doing exactly what you just said, right? They are really focusing on the Web3 native user, right? So as soon as that is the demographic that you choose to go after, I think you need to go and play, the rules of that space, which is you go full decentralized, well, as decentralized as possible within the space we are at, and you sort of like go towards that direction, right? And you start sort of like building on top of that. The downside of that is the size of the audience, right? Especially in this market that has changed immensely compared to 2021. There is a much less active market. It's much harder to sell anything. Volume is pretty much dead at a certain point. Trade volume and all of that, which was obviously one of the incentives for brands to come and play within that space, sort of like have that long tail revenue stream. So I think that's where you start blurring the lines of the experience as well, and why brands are sort of like going left and right. And what I mean by that is that if you want to go more towards your already existing audience and your Web3, Web2 customer, you need to make it simpler. You need to extract the friction, right? And that's why we start seeing email logins, we start seeing off-chain tokens, we start seeing, custodial wallets and so on. So I think that's that very famous Web 2.5 situation on which, a lot of those brands decide to play. And I'm really happy for that, because the ultimate goal is that everybody's going to be operating and being within in Web3, as long as there is incentives and motives and the product and the technology is great, which is not the case yet. Therefore, not everybody's there. But, we working towards to make that happen. But as long as it's not, how do you really create meaningful experiences, or even have like big numbers that will support an entire team just working on that specific part of the business, right? And I think that this balance is what a lot of those brands are trying to figure out right now. How do you sort of like you sit in between, rather than too much on the right or too much on the left, from a Web 2 and Web 3 perspective. And to your point, like, is Web3, is blockchain technology needed for that? I think that we don't have to go full on that to enable it, because if we do, then again, the demographics get so small, and it's so difficult to sort of like create a case that is strong enough to to get enough funds and resources to keep building towards the future, right? Which is in a moment where more and more people are going to be there, and then we can go full decentralized, we can go full blockchain, and there will be enough customers and there will be enough movement there that sort of like incentivize that infrastructure to exist and be built. So I think that we need that sort of like in between situation right now, on which to get where we want to get, we need to go through this bridge, which, it is indeed a bridge between Web 2 and Web 3.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about that Web 2.5, like that I've heard that a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Like in the car example I brought up a second ago, talking about being able to trace like the car records on a car with the digital twin of the car. The issue is you now need all of these mechanics and dealerships to buy into that in order to make it so when the service happens on the car that it gets added to the chain. And so there needs to be a lot of education that kind of pulls those mechanics and those dealerships and all these service providers to be aware of that as the direction that the industry goes in before you can commit to it. Because having the wallet and having the NFT of the car doesn't mean anything if you can't get the data and information on the chain to live with it as it passes from owner to owner. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, that like there needs to be this kind of stepping stone to educate the market and pull more users in versus like an all-in approach for every use case. That doesn't mean that
especially because
sorry,
go on. No, especially because of the size of the companies we're talking about, right? If you're talking car manufacturer, like a company like Volkswagen, just Porsche makes 28 billion in revenue a year. How much of an impact that solution that we're talking about building has to have to be meaningful enough to go through that entire transformation within their ecosystem. And that's far from the case right now, and that's where sort of like where we are sitting.
Yeah, it's that idea of quantifying the problem, right? Like there's the fact that a problem exists doesn't necessarily mean we should invest in solving it. We need to quantify like how much of an economic impact does that problem actually have, and then come up with a reasonable amount of resources to solve for that problem based on how big it actually is. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. One other question I have 100%. For you before pivoting off of the Adidas and enterprise stuff, because I do want to talk to you a little bit about some of the startup stuff that you're doing too. With Adidas, they took an approach of owning that program, right? Like they went in with partners, so that like they owned the program, but that they leaned in with like Bored Ape Yacht Club, for example, and I forget the other two. I think it was like G Money and
Pixel Vault.
And Pixel Vault, yeah. So they partnered with a few partners to make that happen, but they owned the ultimate project and the NFTs they were putting out. Versus Nike took a different approach, right? Like Nike acquired Artifact. They found a company that was doing well in the space and felt it had synergy with their strategy and what they wanted to do. What are some of the pros and cons of a big brand going at it kind of on their own / with partners versus buying a company and kind of pulling it into the fold?
Yeah, I think it's very simple and straightforward. When you go in by yourself, you need to build a boat and figure out how it works. And when you go in with a partner, you buy already a fast boat that you just jump in and go ride together, right? And that's exactly the difference on speed, the difference on knowledge, the difference on skill. You need to sort of like build a team, get resources behind it, put that team under the whole HR ecosystem of a company that has 60,000 people, which is going to take forever to happen. You need to hire those people. Where do you find talents? And you need to sort of like start building that overall strategy, right? So it takes time. It takes time, and it needs to be justified by driving revenue, right? Which is then complex when you really focus just on that Web3 native user where, in a market like we are right now, there's no money to be made, right? So I think that's the key difference. Whereas on an acquisition of intelligence, which was the case, which was brilliant from Nike, they are tying in a lot of what they acquired from an Intel perspective with their already existing ecosystem, right? They're expanding on the already existing ecosystem they have. They're tying that with already products franchise they already have, and they're sort of like making it easy. For example, through BitGo, the wallet solution they've chosen, which is custodial, for anyone to take part of that, right? So again, it's that 2.5 Web 2.5 moment where you obviously losing on the decentralization, you're losing on the composability, you're losing on that sort of like API integrations that smart contract by nature provide, because you're going more siloed with that solution. You cannot learn about what the user is doing outside of your own ecosystem, but facilitating for other people to come and play. So I think that, it's a good comparison on that sense of a route that's going to take more time and it's going to be more difficult and more challenging, to a route that quote unquote will be easier and faster because you're buying Intel, but you're buying a lot of risk as well, right? Like Nike's move was really bold because they bought Artifact and they put their logo right beside their key franchises, right? You had Nike, you had Jordan, you had Converse, and you had Artifact. So it's like it's a big move, and so far it's obviously looking really solid and good. I tend to say that Nike never miss, which it's always exciting to see how they operate and how they go about it. But it's risk. There's risk on both, different strategies, and I working on a daily basis with Americans and Europeans, I can really see, like the European style and the American style on that approach, which is fun. It's just a different way of innovating from a culture perspective.
I didn't even think of it that way, but now that you mention it, like I work with a lot with Europeans as well. I just took on a full-time role with Arthur, which is a VR company with the significant bulk of the team is out in Europe, and there is some cultural differences, right? And like where people are willing to take risk and how they take that risk, and so that's almost a great case study for it, is watching Adidas take a slower, more controlled approach where like they are maintaining more control and mitigating risk, but it takes longer and there's more of a heavy lift of resources to make happen, versus with Nike, like the risk that they didn't fall into, and it seems like it's mostly worked out, is there is a lot of scams out there, right? Like a lot of these projects have fallen apart, and I don't know what their due diligence looked like to make that happen, but I mean, there's plenty of billions of dollars that fell apart with FTX and other things, right? So if you buy the wrong NFT project and there's something hidden in there that you miss, that could be a massive fallback to the whole brand as a whole, right? And could take away from the entire movement, not just in NFTs with Artifact, but also with Roblox and the other things they're doing with Nike Land. Like if one piece of that falls apart, it creates risk for those other channels and other things they're working on.
It's the Wild West. It's where we at.
So, something else so this is the last thing on the enterprise stuff, and then I want to pivot into some of the startup advisory work. So a lot of these enterprises are creating innovation teams. They're trying to solve that problem that you're talking about of moving a little faster, trying to find ways to cut through their own bureaucracy, because they know that the only way that they can innovate in this space is if they find a way to move a little faster, find a way to keep up. And so I'm noticing a trend in innovation teams, Web3 studios, like a lot of big brands are creating these little hubs. And I know that you had some, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you had some involvement with Salesforce with their Web3 studio. I've been following Matthew Sweezy and a little bit of that story too.
Shout out to Sweezy.
Yeah, his content is awesome. I know he's working on some new projects too. That should be pretty exciting.
He's a very good friend.
But I'm curious to get your take on, like, if you're building an innovation hub, like what have you seen work really well? And then like, what are the roles and responsibilities that you need to put together for a big brand to create that sort of like task force or team?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I went through the process of being part of the task force team within Adidas and seeing that transition into a full-time Web3 studio, which I didn't play any role within that, but I witnessed. And I've been part of Porsche's Web3 studio as well, which they end up creating a sub-company to host and mitigate all the risks, to detach the risks, especially from IP perspective and dealing with crypto and so on, as a separate entity. And also have worked really closely with the Web3 studio within Salesforce that now pivot into an innovation studio, right? And that's sort of like the different exposure I've got within those. Obviously, I engage with a lot of different Web3 studio, and other innovation teams, but I witnessed sort of like those being built and pivoting and sort of like finding its place. So, which is interesting. I think that, the first thing I was recommending 3 years ago, almost now, for every single brand that was trying to figure out what to do was a task force, right? Super simple. Task force is a second job that someone just, raised the arm for, and you get people involved from different departments from day one, especially within corporate, legal, finance, and all of that, right? Get those people that will be fundamental to help you navigating this ecosystem, especially, within crypto, bringing a volatile asset like cryptocurrency into a balance sheet of a public traded company is a nightmare. So how do you sort of like navigate through that? What are the must watch outs, right? What can you do? What you can do? How do you mitigate risks? And I think that's extremely important, and a lot of times it's still not very the first thing that people think of. And you know, that's how we did at Adidas back there, and took us. We started to do like that whole strategy in May, and we went to market in December 21. And a great amount of time spent within those months was talking to legal, treasury, corporate, financial, all those teams, right, to sort of like figure out what is the right move. So there's where it's extremely important. And then from there, you can evolve to a Web3 studio, which is going to demand resources. You know, getting a new team set within an organization those size is extremely difficult because you have to go through a gigantic amount of processes. Then you need to have that cost center set up. Then you need to fund that cost center. Usually, you know, budgets are being figured out every 6 months or every 12 months. So to do something, you need to wait till the next time that you can allocate budget to that cost center. Otherwise, you need to be playing with budget around. So there's a lot of complexities, right? And then you need to hire. So then you need to get HR on board. And how the hell will HR hire a Web3 native if they don't even know what Web3 is? Then you need to upscale the HR team, or you need to go to an external company to figure that out. And there's that whole process of it, right? And what can happen, which ended up being probably what happened to Salesforce, and that's assumption, I don't have intel or information there, is that maybe you've ended up building a team that is very initially focused on Web3, whereas they should be focused on other things like AI popped up. What is your point of view? Oh, we don't know. We focus on Web3. Okay, go figure it out. So you sort of like need to keep moving and combining different things, right? Because what we cannot forget, and it's happening, and it's crazy for me to watch, that people are thinking of those technologies as separate things, right? Oh, there is the metaverse. Oh, there is Web3. Oh, there is blockchain. Oh, there is AI. And in reality, what's happening is that all those technologies combined as a suite of technologies are the technologies that are shaping the future, or shaping the way we will be interacting with the internet tomorrow and after tomorrow, right? And from that perspective, that's why sort of like that innovation hub, or that side of things is more interesting for me, because you're able to combine different intel, you're able to source different perspectives into reshaping, you know, in this case, how the web is going to look like. So, you know, I'm close friends with as well with the people from Red Bull that are doing the innovation thing, and that's exactly how they've been operating for a while. You know, and I think that makes more sense. I think that makes sense because you don't get super niched out into one thing, and you have leverage and room to sort of like, you know, get other technologies that are showing up and create a wider strategy rather. Because of course, you know, it's exciting to create a Web3 strategy right now, but it's, you know, it's early. We need to find ways on which we put the overall technology and embed the overall technology within already existing ecosystems within the brand, not creating something separate outside, because it's going to be really, really hard to justify that.
I love the way that you framed that, because it's this holistic view on technology and creative, and how it all kind of comes together. And I think a lot of people like you and I that create content around this space, that talk about this space, that we get a lot of flack right now, because as the technology evolves, like, we might start talking more about the next step, or the technology that's being focused on. So while NFTs and the blockchain and the data layer was a focus for a time, generating content and the experience layer becomes a focus for a different time. It's all interconnected to the same projects, the same campaigns, the same buyers on the enterprise side that are building budgets and running projects need all of it, not some of it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of folks are saying it's like, oh, blockchain's not working, so now they're focused on AI, or AI is not working, so now they're focused on XR. It's like, no, like, all three of these pieces of technology are interwoven together,
Yeah.
to make it all work, right? It's almost like saying they're talking about iOS apps one second, and then they're talking about desktop use cases on a computer the next. It's like they have synergy, they work together. It's not just one or the other, and I think that's a big misconception right now.
Yeah, you don't build a suite of technologies with one technology, right? Your phone operates in hundreds of different technologies at the same time, right? It's exactly the same. We're talking about the future of the web, right? And there's many technologies that play a role within it.
Well, and I also think there's like different things to be skeptical about each layer, right? So like correct me on how you think about this, or tell me if you're aligned. But I think of it as like blockchain is essentially a data layer. It's rethinking the way that we structure the data that lives on that back end, and thinking about how it's more transparent or less transparent, more decentralized or less decentralized. It's rethinking how we store and manage data and interact with data. The top layer is the immersive kind of spatial layer, right? Making the internet more three-dimensional, more interactive, and that could be something simple like Roblox, where you're going onto a computer but in a 3D environment,
Yeah.
or like a car configurator when you're going to buy a car on a website and having access to a 3D model. Or it could be as complicated as getting in a VR headset and fully immersing yourself into a 3D space. That all kind of falls under that experience layer of how you interact with the data. And then in the middle, AI is just scaling the interaction between the two. It's just making it easier to understand the data and run simulations with the data. It's making it easier to create more of the content so that you can scale the content that lives there, because it's a lot harder to build 3D assets than it is to build 2D assets, right? And
Yeah.
so I kind of see it as this almost like sandwich of technology, and then each one has its nuance in what you need to build. So when I think of an innovation team, I think you might have someone who leans more and is more of a data specialist and focused more on the blockchain piece of it. You might have someone else who's like a machine learning engineer that understands LLMs and how to build and manage them. And you might have someone else who's more of a marketer, or someone who's more of a creative, focused on the storytelling with the 3D side. But you kind of need to get all those different people in a room together
Yeah.
so that they can come up with ideas on how to use that technology. Is that
100%.
aligned with how you're thinking about it?
100%. And I think that simplifying this concept of like what is Web3, which we've been reshaping and rethinking and refining more and more. For me, all those technologies play a role within that, right? So you have like blockchain being the backbone, which is exactly what you just said. It's sort of like that data element that is a database at the end of the day, right? If you break it down, what it is a database. It's a decentralized database, right? Which is interoperable. You can connect different things within it. You can plug and play. You can have smart contracts. You can build on top. But in essence, is the database, which is the backbone. And then you have enriched experiences, which then, you can look into VR, AR, haptics, generative AI, 3D scanning, and many different things. And then you have on the other side, you have ownership of things, right? You have digital assets, digital identity, digital currencies, where the ownership really comes into play. And then on top of all of that, is where you have like the interface, which is the metaverse, the new immersive experiences, immersive commerce, immersive web, whatever you want to call, right? So that's the way I'm looking at that, on how all of that together plays a role in reshaping the sort of like the current experience we have in the web. And if you want to look just at the interface, to give an example on how simple it is to see through what's going to happen next by looking at the past, the way we used to connect with each other digitally and interact with each other digitally when we first started with the internet was through chat rooms. We had chat rooms, we had ICQ, we had MSN Messenger, right? That's how we used to connect. And then it evolved. And then we still text, but now we have audio and video like we are having right now. And now it's evolving, and we'll keep evolving. Now we're going to have immersive experience. We're going to have immersive words. We're going to be, represented by avatars in certain points. But we will still text. We will still have video. We still have voice. And something else is going to show up down the road that makes that experience better, or make us feel more connected, or make we enjoy more the time we spend digitally. And it's that simple. We make all those rounds around the technology, but then at the end of the day, it's just another evolution. It's going to be Web 4, it's going to be Web 5, it's going to be Web 6, it's going to keep evolving. It's not the final destination.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like video conferencing hasn't really changed that much in like the last 15 years. Like the only difference is now like Teams and Slack are connecting text and chat room interfaces with video and with audio, and we're seeing a merging of all of the communication channels into single applications. That's the biggest change I think we've made, is consolidation. But with spatial computing, with immersive technology, with whatever words you want to use to describe this new era of tech, it's allowing for something new to happen. And I think that's part of why it's hard to sell it sometimes, for people that are more on the business side, is because it's not necessarily just solving a problem. It does solve some problems. It can make communication more efficient and cut costs on aligning on projects or training people faster. There's literal hard ROI that you can define using 3D spatial computing. But it also opens up this new door. to all these things that you can't do in real life. You aren't limited by real world physics anymore. Exactly. And I think that's really difficult for people to wrap their head around, is these unknown potential gains they can make by taking the risk of experimentation. And like one example that I think kind of ties into that is like you always see like in virtual showrooms like chairs and tables. And I'm like, well, you're not gonna sit in a chair or like set anything on that table, really, right? Like you don't need to. You're floating around in a 3D space.
Yeah.
So I'm excited for like the next 5 to 10 years where we see people rethink what a room can even look like, or how to tell a story when you have these new rules of physics. And so this kind of leans into the startup stuff for our last few minutes here. So with that said, what do you think are some of the problems that aren't being solved right now? Some of the things that if you had the time or the capital to invest in, like what would you want to be building right now if you were to start a new company in the space?
Whew. It's an exciting question. I think that I'm really excited about the intersection of Web3 and AI, you know, like how blockchain is going to play a role, how AI will create problems that blockchain is really well positioned to solve, how AI will create opportunities that blockchain is really well, positioned to solve. So I'm really excited about that sort of intersection, not that either or that a lot of people are looking at, but rather the intersection of how those two things are going to play together. I'm really, really excited about this wild concept of AI agents, right? So how we will have artificial intelligence agents operating under our behalf and going about the internet and doing things that we tell them to do, right? That can be buy things, that can be sell things, that can be monetized, that can be trade, that can be anything, right? Services, products, whatever it is. And the more we move towards a tokenized internet, which is exactly what Web3 will make possible, the easier will become for blockchain to play a role within that AI and blockchain intersection. Because if you were having, purchase of services, sell of services, trade of services, there isn't a better solution than, that tokenization being on chain, and then that whole thing be traceable. You have, provenance and all of that as well. So I'm really excited about that, like how will the ecosystem for those agents be? How does that look like? What is the payment systems around it? I don't think it's going to be banks. I think it's going to be cryptocurrencies. It doesn't have to be a volatile like Bitcoin or Ethereum. It can be, just stable coins or whatever it's going to be. But that's where I'm really excited. I'm, like thinking, wow, imagine how wild that I can really get to the point of making money while I'm sleeping by having AI agents operating under my behalf and building my brand and selling products and doing a bunch of different things in that sense, which I think that going for more of a philosophical direction, I think that by leveraging technologies like that, we will be able to save up more of our time, to use our time with things that, technologies like AI are not necessarily able to do, or are not necessarily able to do yet, within humanity. So I'm excited about that. I'm always looking sort of like to the bright side of things on that side.
Yeah, sorry for the bird noises in the background. I don't know if you're hearing that, but
that's cool.
They're a little obnoxious. I've got the overexposure coming in. It's a little distracting. But anyway,
that's cool.
I think you make a really strong point about this intersection between those two, because blockchain creates new problems, right? And we're seeing that mostly on the user interface side right now, and just making it easier to reduce friction and adopt it. With XR, that's another big set of issues, is like just getting someone in a headset, getting someone to download an application. There's big problems on just ease of use that are getting optimized right now. But with AI, it creates some even bigger problems, right? Like people are afraid about being replaced. But I think one of the biggest ones that blockchain might be able to solve is this idea of like deep fakes. Like we're not going to be able to trust any piece of video content as real evidence of anything anymore. Yeah. But if you can have a way to authenticate it somehow in a way that's automatic and protocoled into the chain, maybe there's an opportunity there to try and help define what's real and 100%. What's not real. Because even with AR
especially
glasses,
provenance, right? Like where the content came from, who created it? Was that really a picture of Trump being arrested in New York running from the police or not? Is the Pope really wearing that puffy jacket or not, right? Like,
yeah, it's super important, right? Like mixed reality is moving in a direction right now where it's not going to be see-through glasses with holograms projected on top of it like we thought it was. It's going to be sensors and cameras that take in the image in front of you. And then that way it's easier to integrate the 3D assets and the AR stuff into that simulated version of what you're looking at. So if that's the case, if we spend more and more of our time looking like through a recreation of reality instead of at reality, well, that creates a huge amount of risk on who controls perception, who controls what you see as real and not real.
Yeah.
And we need not only government regulation, because that is important, like we need to find ways to regulate guidelines around this, but you need actual technology baked into all these headsets and to all these pieces of software that have indicators of the provenance of where this thing comes from and like what actually are you looking at, because your brain's not going to be able to figure out on its own anymore.
100%. Yeah, I see that as a use case of the now, right? It's needed right now. It could be done right now. So, it's a now. The next, what I think is interesting is within that sort of like DeFi space, because we have so many different chains right now, and they're all not connected, and they all work in different ways, and you need to bridge from left to B, from A to B, and all of that. And that's where I think that AI can play a big role of like accelerating that merge and that sort of like bridging of all those different chains to finally get to a place where there's real interoperability. So I think that being, a big problem to solve, where I think AI can be a pretty helpful tool for. And then like the later is that agent stuff, right? Like the futuristic stuff, which I think is going to come.
Yeah, I know it's too early to plug them right now, but I know I have a couple friends working on AI like assistants and digital twins of your persona, and I want to do a full episode about that at some point. I think it's really, really interesting, the possibilities of what can happen there, learning things about yourself that you wouldn't know about yourself and stuff like that. But coming up on time, there is one last thing, and then I want to let you have an opportunity to plug. I know you were doing some advisory work for Landvault, and I've met those guys a few times. I actually want to get Sam on the show. He mentioned he was interested, and so hoping to do that at some point. But I was curious to get your take on Landvault's story of this like Web2 assisting in gaming advertising, pulling brands into games, and then pivoting to chain and like becoming a Web3 brand for the same thing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that pivot that they're making and any of the work you might be doing with Landvault?
Yeah, it's interesting and exciting because it's very similar to my story I was saying before, right? They were really focused on games and sort of like not the esports side of it, but also in platform ad placements, for example. And then they saw an opportunity to build metaverse experience for brands. That's where we got connected. And and now they are sort of like working with governments and building digital twin cities or things on that direction. So it's interesting to see like the different depths that you can find within our industry and the different opportunities as well. Obviously, their move to Dubai and the region speaks quite strongly on that sense. The work we've done together is basically they've worked with a bunch of different brands that a lot of times they need an extra hand or an extra pair of eyes on things that they're developing and how they're looking to the strategy, how they're looking to the experience, how brands are looking on how to sort of like go to market with that, and that's pretty much the work we've done together.
Amazing. And did they went through like a big merger of some kind, right? So you mentioned they're building digital twins and things like that. Did they merge with like a service-based agency? Because they were focused mostly on ad placement, right? Was that a new skill set they brought in?
That was AdMix, and then they bought Landvault through AdMix, and Landvault became sort of like that organic builder for them because that's what we were doing before anyway.
The reason I mentioned that or emphasized that piece of their story is Exclusible kind of did the same thing, where they were more of an NFT agency, and then they brought in Polycount as a studio arm. And I'm seeing a big trend in that with these small agencies and small tech companies that are all kind of building. They're starting to kind of merge together and create these slightly larger offerings. And I think it ties into what you were saying before about like in order to be successful with any of these technologies, you kind of need a holistic offering. So if you only do NFTs, you're not really going to be able to survive and be successful. If you're only doing content generation and producing 3D assets, that's pretty limited and tough too. You kind of need to have this holistic set of skills in order to be a trusted partner for a big brand, to really help them. On that note, I know we've only got 60 seconds. So Diego, I want to give you a chance. Where can people find you? Anything you want to plug? This has been so great. So where can people find more about you?
Yeah, thanks, man. Wild West of Web3, my newsletter. I'm gonna give you the link, and you can link that on the show notes if you want. That's the
Perfect.
place. I built that about 2 months ago now, and we consistently putting content out. That's where I'm getting everything I'm getting exposed to and putting in one place, right? Like the things I'm experiencing. I'm all about talking about things I see, I'm part of, I'm experienced. So there's no news, there's no like summary of what's happening in the industry. It's literally what I see every day. It's literally the stuff that it's coming across, people that I'm talking with, brands that I'm engaging with, tech companies that I'm working with, thoughts that I'm having, or people that I'm talking every day, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I'm gonna get a part of that and build on top. So that's this place. That's sort of like the creative juice is going all there.
Yeah, I know there's 1.5 million newsletters out there, but this is coming from one of the guys that's like the most interconnected into this stuff. So if you're interested in the business side and the go-to-market side of emerging technology, then I highly encourage you follow Diego's content, engage with him if you have projects. This is definitely the guy that you want to be listening to when it comes to these topics. But on that note, I know we both got meetings we got to jet to, so I'm going to go ahead and call the pod there.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate you.